I think that conservation of historic and built environment is an important factor for us to demonstrate how developed a society or a country is. So that's why I'm very interested in conservation.
Conservation means to me trying to understand what is important from the past, who it's important to, and trying to come to some consensus on what we should save and why.
An understanding and appreciation of our history, real sustainability, and the most important emotional response to place and buildings.
To try and make sure conservation is understood as not just a whim of a conservation officer to try and do things in a certain way, but try and convey to people what the significance of places and buildings are.
This is what conservation means to me, concrete, and all sorts of other things that are to do with the 20th century.
Sustainability for the future, discovering new and exciting places and developing them in order to protect them for new generations.
Conservation to me means looking after the world around you. Some people choose to do that in nature, I choose to do that in the urban environment.
Growing up in a drafty late Victorian manse in the middle of nowhere that was falling apart, then got me interested in old buildings and why they're important and why we keep them, and that's led me into a degree in history and then conservation, and now I enjoy working for Historic England.
I worked for Rideout Associates when he first started up his business in timber decay, and mostly buildings which were damaged by fire, such as the Park House and Windsor Castle. And I thought, absolutely fantastic, and that hooked me.
I got into conservation by taking my master's degree in historic environment conservation at the Ironbridge Institute. Alongside this, I volunteered with the heritage team at the CRT for 3 years. My first job was as a conservation area assistant at Stafford Borough Council, and I'm now conservation officer at Worcester City Council.
I got into conservation through my work with English Heritage. I work at Kenilworth Castle, and then developing it on this course and learning about the sort of theory of it and really getting into it through that.
Well, I worked as a planner in development control for over 20 years, and I was always much more interested in the applications around listed buildings and conservation areas. So when I was looking for an alternative direction for my career, I took myself off for a year and did the Oxford Brookes course in historic building conservation, and now I have a fantastic job with Gloucester City Council looking after their heritage.
I got into conservation because I got carted around lots of French chateaux as a child, and it must have got highly ingrained in me.
In my first job, I loved going out with a conservation officer to the villages to look at old buildings. So later in life, I did a conservation MA, and I'm still a town planner, but I have a love of old buildings.
Trained in Sheffield, but also did a bit in Liverpool, and find conservation a myriad of interesting, different things, challenging both buildings and people, but I love it.
It's really gutters that turn me on. So I'm the kind of gutter nutter because I saw that so much money was being wasted on buildings or not being spent on buildings because they hadn't retained and looked after their rainwater goods. So really it's gutters that turned my mind.
I came into conservation following 15 years of teaching secondary school history, decided that the historic environment was much more exciting, and I then retrained doing the Ironbridge MA course with Harriet Devlin, which is absolutely brilliant.
I got into conservation basically being the son of a small builder. I then trained with Ministry of Works working on old buildings and new buildings. Did that for 20 years and finally migrated for the last 22 years till retirement with English Heritage.
Why did I come into conservation? Father, history, archaeology, university.
I'm a chartered building surveyor. I retrained about 8 years ago because of my interest in historic buildings, and being part of the IHBC is my opportunity to get involved and to meet lots of people and to try and get more involved in the field of conservation, really.
I got into conservation through a real interest in history and architecture, and it's a good way to combine the two in, understanding the past and understanding how architecture's developed, how we can move forward with planning.
I originally got into conservation because my parents were always interested in historic buildings, and from a very early age we traipsed around old houses and things like that, so that's why I ended up going into conservation.
I trained originally as a parish priest. I was a parish priest in the Church of England for over 25 years, and I got into conservation because I introduced some very radical new innovations into a building in Hereford, All Saints Hereford, cafe and all sorts of stuff. We had so many inquiries from all over the country that I thought there's something here. And that's how I got into conservation. I went off and retrained in a postgraduate diploma, and I now work as a place of worship support officer in the Diocese of Worcester.
I got into conservation because I used to work in museums, and I worked in Birmingham Central Library, which I think is a really interesting and problematic building, and that made me start to think about conservation. I don't really know what conservation means to me apart from thinking about how we can make historic buildings viable today.
I've been really lucky to live in so many different places. I've lived in Peterlee and Newtown in the north of England, the Georgian city of Bath and many other places around the world. I'm always interested hugely in my visual environment, but I want to know why it's there, who lived in it, what are all the power structures that put it there, and how can we make sure that other people can be lucky enough to learn about their history through these sorts of buildings.
I don't believe that we can or should save everything, but I also believe that we should try and democratise a bit more who makes those decisions and take different viewpoints.